They say a woman's value is measured by the man who chooses her. Lady Elyra Vaelor learned different. Standing in a palace of black marble while 400 nobles watched her fiancé choose another woman's bloodline over her devotion, she discovered something the world doesn't teach daughters of ambition. Loyalty is currency until someone offers a better price. What she did next didn't just flip the script, it rewrote the entire damn game. Stick with me to the end of this story. You're going to want to see how a discarded woman becomes an empress. Drop a like and comment your city below, so I know my tribe is paying attention. The kingdom of Vareth existed under skies the color of old steel, where power wore velvet gloves over iron fists, and every smile at court carried a blade behind it. Nightspire Citadel rose from the mountain ridge like something carved by gods who'd run out of mercy, all black stone and sharp edges that caught the light like threat-made architecture. Lady Elyra Vaelor stood before her mirror in the eastern wing, and the woman looking back at her was a masterpiece of calculated perfection. 25 years old, educated in 4 languages, trained in diplomatic protocol since childhood, every hair pinned exactly where it needed to be, every gesture measured, every word weighed before it left her mouth. She'd spent 3 years becoming exactly what Lord Cassian Thornvale needed. Not wanted, needed. There's a difference women learn too late. Her handmaid, Mira, fastened the last clasp on the midnight blue gown, the one chosen specifically because Cassian had once mentioned he liked her in darker colors. Elyra had memorized every offhand comment, every preference, every political anxiety that crossed his face during late-night strategy sessions. She'd made herself indispensable, or so she'd believed. Mira's hands trembled slightly as she worked. The girl was 16, observant, loyal. She'd seen something. Elyra caught her eye in the mirror. "What is it?" The handmaid's throat worked. "My lady, there are rumors from the kitchens." Elyra's voice stayed level. "There are always rumors from the kitchens. These are different. They say Lord Cassian met with the Harrow family last night, in private. They say Lady Seraphine Harrow wore mourning white, which means it means nothing until it means something." Finished the clasp, but her pulse kicked up despite the iron grip she kept on her expression. The Harrows controlled the southern mineral territories. Seraphine was 17, beautiful in that untouched way men mistake for purity, and she carried a dowry that could fund a small war. More importantly, she carried legitimacy. Seraphine's bloodline connected to the old throne, back before the Fracture Wars split Vareth into competing dominions. Cassian had ambitions that stretched beyond the eastern territories. He wanted the crown itself, and crown hunting required the right kind of wife, the kind whose name appeared in genealogy records that mattered. Elyra had given Cassian 3 years of her life. She'd negotiated with hostile houses while he drank wine and complained about his father's expectations. She'd memorized trade routes and tax structures and marriage alliances spanning 6 generations. She'd held his political career together with her bare hands while he took credit in public and her devotion for granted in private. She'd loved him, past tense, because standing there in that dress, with rumors crawling up from the kitchen and Mira's frightened eyes watching her in the mirror, Elyra felt the future shifting like ground before an earthquake. Love isn't survival. Survival is survival. And tonight, at the midwinter convocation where their formal engagement was supposed to be announced, she was about to learn exactly how disposable devotion made a woman. Said, the Great Hall of Nightspire could hold 1,000 people when packed tight. Tonight it held 400 of the most dangerous aristocrats in Vareth, all of them dressed in silk and jewels and barely concealed malice. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings like frozen stars. Silver war banners from a dozen conquered territories draped the walls. The air smelled like expensive wine, burning incense, and political desperation. Elyra entered alone. That should have been her first warning. Cassian was supposed to meet her at the eastern entrance to walk her in on his arm the way they'd planned. Instead, she found herself navigating through clusters of nobles who watched her with the kind of attention vultures give dying things. "Lady Vaelor, how lovely you look tonight." The voice belonged to Duchess Corinna Vale, a woman who'd buried 3 husbands and inherited their combined wealth with suspicious efficiency. She smiled with too many teeth. Elyra returned the smile with equal sharpness. "Duchess, I'd compliment your gown, but I believe I saw it at last season's convocation." The Duchess's expression went brittle. "At least some of us have the luxury of wearing things twice. I hear the Vaelor fortunes have been rather strained lately. The dig landed exactly where intended. Elyra's family had money once. Her father had gambled it away on failed investments before drinking himself into an early grave. Her mother had died 3 years later from what the physicians called a wasting sickness, but what Elyra knew was actually just giving up. She'd been 17, alone. Educated enough to be useful, but broke enough to be desperate. Cassian had found her at a border tournament, chaperoned by a distant aunt who saw her as a burden. He'd been charmed by her intelligence, or maybe he'd just recognized an asset he could acquire cheaply. Either way, she'd attached herself to his rising ambitions like her life depended on it. Because it had. Elyra kept her voice light. Fortunes rise and fall, Duchess. It's the nature of the game. The question is whether you're still playing when they rise again. She moved past before Karenna could respond, but the damage was done. Blood in the water. Every conversation she passed seemed to pause just long enough for her to feel the weight of collective attention. They knew. Whatever was about to happen, the whole damn court already knew. She found Cassian near the central dais, surrounded by Eastern lords and looking like a man who'd just won something significant. He wore black and silver, the colors of his house, and his smile had that satisfied edge that made her stomach turn. Lady Seraphine Harrow stood 3 feet to his left, radiant in ice-blue silk that matched her eyes. Elyra's world tilted. She'd seen political maneuvers before. She'd participated in them. But there's a difference between understanding strategy in theory and watching yourself get sacrificed on the board in real time. Cassian saw her approaching. Something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, calculation. He was measuring her reaction, determining how much damage control he'd need. Elyra. His voice carried across the space between them with practiced warmth. I was just speaking with Lord Harrow about the Southern Territories. She stopped precisely the right distance away. Close enough to appear connected, far enough to maintain dignity. Lord Harrow. Lady Seraphine. How pleasant to see you both. Seraphine's smile was sugar over steel. Lady Elyra. Cassian speaks so highly of your counsel. He says you have quite the mind for politics. The compliment was an insult wrapped in courtesy. Your counsel, not your partnership, not your worth, just your usefulness. Elyra matched the smile. He's generous with his praise, though I find the best counsel is the kind that leads to action rather than just conversation. Lord Harrow cleared his throat. Indeed. Which is why we're pleased to announce that my daughter and Lord Thornvale have reached an agreement that will unite our houses. The words landed like a blade between ribs. Around them, conversation stopped. Nobles turned. Elyra could feel 400 pairs of eyes watching her face, waiting for the breakdown, the tears, the humiliation they could feast on for months. She gave them nothing. Her expression stayed perfectly composed. How wonderful for both houses. Cassian had the decency to look uncomfortable for maybe 3 seconds. Elyra, perhaps we should speak privately. About what, precisely? You've made your position quite clear. His jaw tightened. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You understand politics. This is about legacy, about legitimacy. The Harrow connection opens doors that I couldn't open. She finished for him, voice calm as winter morning. Because my bloodline isn't recorded in the right dusty books. Because my family fortune disappeared before I was old enough to save it. Because devotion and intelligence and 3 years of holding your ambitions together apparently don't matter when someone offers better terms. People were definitely listening now. Cassian's face flushed. You're being emotional. No, I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She reached up to her throat and unfastened the obsidian bond seal he'd given her 8 months ago. It was a beautiful thing, carved with both their house symbols intertwined. She'd worn it every day since he'd placed it there in his father's library, whispering promises about their future. Promises, it turned out, had expiration dates. She held the seal out to him. Since you're making new agreements, you'll need this back. Cassian didn't take it. His voice dropped low. Elyra, don't humiliate yourself. The words hit like a slap. Humiliate herself. As if she was the one breaking faith. As if she was the one trading 3 years of loyalty for a better offer. As if her pain was somehow more embarrassing than his betrayal. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she'd shaped her life around, and saw him clearly for maybe the first time. He was weak. Not in the way the world counts weakness. He was strong enough physically, clever enough politically. But he was weak where it mattered, in the spine, in the place where people decide whether they're going to be the kind of person who keeps promises or the kind who breaks them when something shinier appears. She walked to the central altar where formal bonds were traditionally blessed and laid the obsidian seal on the stone surface. The sound it made was small. The silence that followed was enormous. Elyra turned back to face the assembled nobles. Her voice carried through the hall with perfect clarity. Lord Thornvale has made his choice based on what he believes serves his ambitions best. I respect his right to do so. I wish him and Lady Seraphine great happiness in their union. She meant none of it. Every word was acid wrapped in courtesy. But she delivered it with such grace that refusing to accept it would make Cassian look petty. Then she walked toward the main doors, spine straight, head high, while 400 nobles watched what they believed was a woman's complete destruction. Duchess Karena's voice drifted after her, pitched to carry. Such composure. Almost makes you forget she's leaving with nothing. Elyra didn't break stride. She made it past the bronze doors, down the marble corridor, through the outer courtyard. Made it all the way to the iron gates before her legs started shaking. The night air hit her face like cold water. Winter fog rolled through the mountain passes, thick enough to swallow the world. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. She pressed her back against the stone wall and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The rage, the betrayal, the humiliation of standing in that hall while everyone watched her become irrelevant. 30 seconds. Then she locked it down, because survival didn't care about feelings. She needed to think, needed to plan. Her rooms in Cassian's estate were no longer an option. Her family's old holdings had been sold years ago. She had some jewelry, maybe enough to last a few months if she was careful. After that, hoofbeats on stone. Elyra looked up to see 6 midnight black horses climbing the mountain road through the fog, pulling a war carriage marked with a symbol that made her blood freeze. A crown pierced by iron thorns. The royal seal. King Vaelor Drakar's personal carriage. What in hell was the King of Vareth doing here? The carriage stopped 20 feet from where she stood. For a moment, nothing happened. Just fog and silence and her heart hammering against her ribs. Then the door opened. A man stepped down, and Elyra's breath caught despite herself. She'd seen King Vaelor from a distance at state functions, seen him on the dais during court sessions, seen his portrait in every administrative building across the Eastern Territories. None of it had prepared her for him up close. He was maybe 40, built like someone who'd spent more time in armor than silk. Battle scars crossed his hands like old stories written in scar tissue. His face was all hard angles and harder eyes, the kind that missed nothing and forgave less. He wore black and silver, same as Cassian, but where Cassian wore it like costume, Vaelor wore it like a second skin. Power didn't announce itself on him. It just was. Lady Elyra Vaelor, his voice was rough winter stone. "We need to talk." She found her voice somewhere beneath the shock. "Your Majesty, I'm not sure what we have to discuss." His expression didn't change. "Don't waste my time with false modesty. You just walked out of that hall with more dignity than half the nobles in there will ever possess. That's worth discussing. How do you even know what happened in there?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "Because I engineered it." The world went very still. Vaelor continued, his tone matter-of-fact. 3 days ago, I withdrew military backing from Cassian Thornvale's territorial claim in the disputed borderlands. I made sure he knew his ambitions required a stronger political alliance than his current arrangement provided. I calculated he'd do exactly what weak men do when desperate. Trade away the valuable for the immediately useful. Elyra stared at him. "You deliberately sabotaged my engagement." "I sabotaged his delusion that he could build an empire on charm and borrowed intelligence. You were collateral damage, but useful collateral damage." The casual cruelty of it knocked the breath from her lungs. "Useful." His eyes narrowed. "Don't pretend outrage. You're too smart for that performance. You knew what you were to him. An asset. The only difference between Thornvale and me is I'm honest about the transaction." She should have been furious. Should have told him to go to hell and walked away into the fog. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What do you want?" "For you to get in the carriage And let me explain why your terrible evening is actually the best thing that's happened to your life. The interior of the royal carriage smelled like leather and steel, and something darker she couldn't identify. Weapon oil, maybe. Or old blood. Vaelor sat across from her, taking up space like a natural disaster forced into human form. Outside, the horses started moving, carrying them away from Nightspire and up into the mountain passes. Elyra kept her hands folded in her lap, refusing to show nerves. Why am I here? Because you understand something most nobles never learn. That power isn't inherited, it's taken. You spent 3 years building Cassian Thornvale's political career from nothing. You negotiated with houses that wanted to eat him alive. You turned a mediocre lord into someone people actually took seriously, and he threw me away the second someone offered better terms. Exactly. Vaelor leaned forward slightly. Which proves you were wasted on him. But it doesn't mean you were wasted. She met his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh to whatever lived underneath. What are you offering? Marriage. The word hung between them like a blade. Elyra laughed. It came out harsher than she intended. You're joking. I don't joke about political strategy. The empire is fracturing. The Ash Dominion is gaining strength in the northern provinces. Old aristocratic families are circling like vultures, waiting for weakness. I need an empress who understands that power is a job, not a fairy tale. Someone who knows how to navigate hostile courts and turn enemies into assets. Someone who's already proven she can build empires for ungrateful men. You're asking me to marry you because I'm competent. I'm asking you to marry me because you're angry, brilliant, and just humiliated enough to want revenge on everyone who watched you fall tonight. His voice was completely calm. I can give you that revenge. Not the cheap kind, the real kind. The kind where you stand above every person who pitied you and watch them realize exactly what they're looking at. She should have said no, should have been horrified by the cold calculation of it all. Instead, she felt something dangerous unfold in her chest. Possibility. What are the terms? Smart question. He sat back. I give you royal protection for your remaining family. Political authority as empress. A real seat on the Imperial Council with actual decision-making power. Your voice shapes policy, military strategy, succession planning. You're not decorative, you govern. And in return, you give me loyalty, intelligence, and public presentation as a unified front. You help me hold this empire together. You produce heirs if we're compatible enough for that to happen naturally. And you accept that this is business, not romance. The honesty was almost brutal, but it was honest. She studied him in the dim carriage light. This man who ruled through fear and strategy and iron discipline, who just admitted he'd destroyed her previous life as a tactical move, who was now offering her power with the same casual directness other men offered flowers. One more question. He waited. When you decided to sabotage Cassian, did you consider the cost to me at all? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent. Yes. And you did it anyway. Yes. Because the empire matters more than individual comfort, including my own. That's what ruling means, Lady Elyra. Choosing necessary damage over catastrophic collapse. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, you're free to leave this carriage at the next outpost. I'll give you enough gold to start over somewhere Cassian's humiliation won't follow you. She could take it, could disappear into one of the western cities, reinvent herself, build something small and safe. Small and safe. The words tasted like ash. She'd never wanted small. She'd wanted power, wanted to matter, wanted to look at the world and know she'd shaped it. Cassian had offered her that, then proven it was all illusion the second something better came along. Vaelor was offering the same thing, except he was being honest about the transaction from the start. I have conditions. His eyebrow raised fractionally. Go ahead. I won't be paraded around as a prize. I won't smile and wave while men make actual decisions. If I'm empress in function, not just title. That means real authority, real consequences if I'm wrong, real credit if I'm right. Agreed. I want Cassian Thornvale to watch me stand beside you at the next state convocation. I want every noble who saw me walk out tonight to see me walk back in wearing the crown. Petty, but understandable. Agreed. And if you ever betray me the way he did, I won't leave quietly. I'll burn your empire down from the inside and make sure everyone knows why." Vaelor's smile was sharp and cold as winter stars. "Now you're talking like an empress." He extended his hand across the carriage space. She looked at it for a long moment. This hand that had signed execution orders and peace treaties, that had held swords and scepters and probably throats when necessary. This was the moment, the choice that would define everything after. She could refuse, walk away, build something smaller and safer somewhere else. Or she could take the hand of the most dangerous man in Vareth and bet everything on her own ability to survive at the highest level of power. Elyra reached out and gripped his hand. His skin was warm despite the cold carriage, calloused from sword work, strong enough to crush bone if he wanted. He didn't crush. He shook once, firm and final. Deal. They arrived at the Obsidian Palace as dawn broke over the mountains. Elyra had heard stories about the royal seat. Everyone had. Tales of corridors that went on forever, of rooms that changed purpose depending on who walked through them, of secrets buried so deep in the black stone that even the kings who built the place had forgotten them. Reality was somehow more and less than legend. The palace was massive, yes, but it wasn't magical, just strategic. Every corridor offered multiple escape routes. Every room had sightlines designed for defense. The whole structure existed as a fortress pretending to be a home. A woman waited in the entrance hall. She was maybe 60, wearing deep purple silk and enough jewelry to fund a small army. Her eyes were the same cold calculation as Vaelor's, and when she looked at Elyra, there was assessment rather than welcome. Dowager Sarastra Drucker. Vaelor's voice carried a note Elyra hadn't heard before, almost warmth. "Aunt, this is Lady Elyra Vaelor, my future empress." Sarastra's expression didn't change. "I heard about the Thornvale situation. Sloppy of him. Useful for us." She looked Elyra up and down like merchandise. "Can she hold a court?" Elyra spoke before Vaelor could. "I held Cassian Thornvale's court for 3 years while he drank wine and pretended to be important. I can manage yours." The dowager's lips curved slightly. "She has spine." "Good. The last thing we need is another decorative royal who faints at the sight of blood. Come with me, girl. We have 6 weeks before the midwinter convocation. That's not enough time to teach you everything you'll need, but it's enough to keep you from getting eaten alive." She turned and walked deeper into the palace, without waiting to see if Elyra followed. Vaelor caught Elyra's eye. "My aunt raised me after my parents died in the Fracture Wars. She's survived 4 different attempts on her life and orchestrated the downfall of 2 rival houses. If she offers to teach you, accept. Is that a command? It's advice. There's a difference." Elyra looked at this man who'd just promised her an empire and threatened her with honesty in the same breath. "What happens now?" "Now you learn how to be someone no one can throw away." His voice was rough stone. "Because the empire doesn't forgive weakness, Lady Elyra. And I don't marry weak women." He walked away toward a different corridor, boots echoing on black marble. Elyra stood alone in the entrance hall of the Obsidian Palace, wearing a ball gown from another life, about to follow a dangerous old woman into an education and power she'd never asked for. Somewhere in the Eastern Territories, Cassian Thornvale was probably waking up next to his new alliance, satisfied he'd made the smart choice. Somewhere in the northern provinces, enemies were sharpening knives and planning rebellions. Somewhere in her own chest, Elyra felt something cold and sharp and absolutely relentless take root. She'd been discarded once. She'd make damn sure it never happened again. Sarastra's voice echoed from deeper in the palace. "Are you coming, or shall I tell the king his empress is too frightened to walk through doors?" Elyra moved forward, following the dowager's voice into corridors that smelled like power and old violence, into a life she hadn't chosen but was about to claim anyway, into the dangerous territory between survival and sovereignty. Behind her, the sun rose over Vareth's capital. Ahead of her, 6 weeks until she'd stand before every noble who'd watched her fall and show them exactly what they'd failed to see. That you could throw away a woman like Elyra Vaelor, but you couldn't keep her down. And the ones who tried were about to learn the difference between a discarded mistress and an empress who'd earned her crown in blood and iron, and the absolute refusal to let anyone define her worth except herself. The education began immediately. Sarastra led her through winding corridors to a private wing that overlooked the northern valleys. The rooms were beautiful in a severe way. No softness. All clean lines and sharp edges and windows positioned for maximum light. This will be yours until the wedding. After that, you'll share the royal quarters with Vaelor. But for now, privacy. She gestured to a sitting room where breakfast had already been laid out. Eat, then we talk. Elyra realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Her stomach was a knot of acid and adrenaline, but she forced herself to sit and take bread and cheese. Sarastra poured tea with precise movements. Tell me what you know about ruling. I know how to navigate hostile courts, how to negotiate without appearing threatening, how to turn enemies into allies by finding what they need and offering it before they realize they need it. Those are skills for survival in someone else's power structure. The dowager's eyes were sharp. I'm asking what you know about actually holding power yourself. Elyra met her gaze. Honestly, nothing. Good. Sarastra sat across from her. Honesty is rare in these halls. Most people arrive pretending they know everything, and that arrogance kills them before the month is out. You've just admitted ignorance, which means you can learn. She pulled out a leather-bound book and opened it to a page covered in dense handwriting and diagrams. This is the map of power in Vareth. Every major house, their alliances, their debts, their secrets. You have 6 weeks to memorize all of it. Elyra looked at the pages. There had to be 200 families listed. All. Because the moment you stand beside Vaelor as empress, every single one of these families will test you. They'll test whether you're intelligent, whether you're ruthless, whether you can be manipulated or intimidated, and if you fail even one test, they'll smell blood and circle until you're destroyed. What kind of test? Everything. A duchess will insult your dress to see if you cry. A lord will question your legitimacy to see if you defend yourself or crumble. Someone will spread a rumor about you being a spy or a whore or a puppet, and you'll need to shut it down so completely that no one tries it again. And if I can't, then you'll be dead within a year. Maybe not literally, though that's possible too, but dead in the ways that matter. Powerless. Irrelevant. A decorative figurehead everyone ignores while they plot around you. The tea tasted like bitter earth. How do I stop that? Sarastra smiled, and it wasn't kind. You become more dangerous than they are. Not louder, not crueler. More dangerous. You know things they don't want known. You have leverage they can't counter. You make alliances they can't break. And most importantly, you make them understand that attacking you costs more than tolerating you. She flipped through more pages, pointing out families and their weaknesses. House Marin controls the river trade, drowning in debt from their son's gambling. You help them restructure quietly. They owe you. House Cole, military power in the south. The matriarch hates her eldest son. You give her reason to name the second son heir instead. You gain an ally who knows she wouldn't have power without you. House Vren. Mineral rights in the Western Territories. Their patriarch is dying. 3 children fighting over succession. You back the smartest one publicly before the father dies. That child becomes head of house with your fingerprints on their crown. On and on. A spider web of power and debt and leverage and fear. Elyra's head spun, but she forced herself to focus, to commit names and faces and secrets to memory. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky outside. Sarastra finally closed the book. Enough for today. You'll practice formal protocol tomorrow. Speech patterns. How to stand, how to move, how to command a room without appearing to command it. Elyra's voice was rough from disuse. Why are you helping me? The dowager's expression shifted slightly, something almost soft underneath the steel. Because Vaelor needs someone who won't break. This empire is held together with spit and threats and his personal refusal to let it collapse. He can't do it alone forever. He needs a partner who's strong enough to share the weight. She stood, smoothing her skirts. And because I watched too many royal women get destroyed by courts that saw them as decorative obligations rather than actual power. If you're going to wear the crown, girl, you're going to wear it like it means something. She left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Elyra sat alone in the sitting room as evening painted the mountains purple and gold. Somewhere in the palace, Vaelor was probably handling whatever crisis kings handled. Somewhere in the eastern territories, Cassian was celebrating his new alliance. Somewhere in the northern provinces, enemies were gathering strength. And here, in this room overlooking valleys she'd never seen before, Elyra felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to settle on her shoulders. She'd jumped from one political arrangement into another, but this time she'd jumped with her eyes open. This time she was choosing power over promises. This time, if she fell, it wouldn't be because someone threw her away. It would be because she'd bet everything on her own strength and lost. That thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing she'd experienced in years. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the capital as lights began to glow in the darkness below. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to become someone who could stand beside a king and not be consumed by his shadow. 6 weeks to turn humiliation into power. 6 weeks to prove that the woman Cassian Thornvale had discarded was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Elyra pressed her palm against the cold glass and made herself a promise in the gathering dark. She would survive this. She would master this. And when she stood before those nobles again, wearing the crown they'd never imagined she could reach, she would smile. Not with forgiveness, with victory. Because the world was about to learn something it should have known already. That throwing away a woman like Elyra Vaelor didn't make her disappear. It made her dangerous. And dangerous women with nothing left to lose and everything to prove were the ones who changed empires. The next morning arrived before Elyra was ready for it. A sharp knock on her door at dawn. Not a request. A summons. She'd barely slept. The bed was too soft. The silence too complete. And her mind wouldn't stop replaying the look on Cassian's face when she'd laid down that bond seal. The satisfaction in it. The relief. Like he'd been waiting for an excuse. The knock came again, harder. She pulled on her robe and opened the door to find a servant girl younger than Mira, eyes downcast, holding a tray with tea and a folded note. From the Dowager Sarastra. Training begins in 1 hour. Breakfast room, 3rd floor, east wing. Do not be late. The girl scurried off before Elyra could respond. She drank the tea standing by the window, watching the capital wake up below. Smoke from morning fires. Merchants setting up stalls. Life continuing like the world hadn't just tilted sideways for one discarded noblewoman who'd gambled everything on a king's cold proposition. 58 minutes later, she found the breakfast room. Sarastra sat at a long table covered in papers, charts, and what looked like chess pieces arranged in complex patterns. She didn't look up when Elyra entered. "You're 2 minutes early. Good." Punctuality signals respect without appearing desperate. "Sit." Elyra sat. The dowager pushed a piece of bread across the table. "Eat while we work. Your body needs fuel. Vanity about your figure can wait until after you've secured power." The bluntness was almost refreshing after years of Cassian's court, where everything was subtext and implication. She ate. Sarastra began without preamble. "Today we address the fundamental problem with your current presentation. You move like someone who's spent years trying not to take up space, apologizing with your posture, making yourself smaller so men feel bigger. I never apologized for anything." The dowager's smile was sharp. "Your mouth didn't apologize. Your body did it constantly, the way you angled your shoulders, how you'd step back when Thornvale approached. Small concessions, repeated 1,000 times, until you trained everyone around you to see you as secondary." Elyra wanted to argue, but memory was an unforgiving mirror. All those moments of adjusting herself to fit Cassian's comfort, moving out of his way, lowering her voice when his was raised, physical deference disguised as courtesy. "How do I fix it?" "You relearn how to occupy space like you own it." Sarastra stood. "Get up." They spent the next 3 hours on what the dowager called postural authority. How to stand so that people instinctively gave ground. How to enter a room so that conversation paused. How to sit in a chair like it was a throne, regardless of what furniture it actually was. Your spine is a weapon. Keep it straight. Shoulders back but not rigid. Chin level. Eyes forward. When you look at someone, look at them. Not past them, not down, not away. At them. Like you're reading every secret they think they're hiding. Elyra tried. Failed. Tried again. Sarastra was merciless. You're still folding inward, chest open. Claim the air in front of you. When you breathe, breathe like you have a right to it. By midday, Elyra's back ached and sweat dampened her dress despite the cool air. Better. Sarastra circled her like a predator evaluating prey. Not good, but better. Tomorrow we work on voice projection and the art of the devastating pause. For now, rest. You have a fitting this afternoon. What fitting? For your court presentation. You can't stand beside the king wearing borrowed silk and Eastern provincial styling. You need something that makes every woman in that hall feel inadequate and every man reconsider their assumptions. The dowager left, her footsteps precise as blade strikes on the marble floor. Elyra collapsed into a chair and pressed her palms against her eyes. This was day 1. She had 41 days left, and already her entire body hurt from the effort of learning to stand differently. But here's what the world doesn't tell you about transformation. It doesn't happen in moments of inspiration. It happens in the brutal repetition of small changes until the old version of yourself becomes unrecognizable. Until the woman who apologized with her posture is buried so deep she can't claw her way back out. That's the real price of power, not what you gain, what you kill inside yourself to make room for it. The seamstress arrived with an entourage of assistants carrying bolts of fabric in colors Elyra had never seen before. Deep crimsons that looked like congealed blood. Blacks so absolute they seemed to absorb light. Silvers that moved like liquid mercury. A severe woman named Katrine took measurements with the detached efficiency of someone cataloging a corpse. The dowager says you need 3 ensembles, 1 for the wedding ceremony, 1 for the coronation, 1 for the midwinter convocation where you'll be formally presented to court. She draped fabric across Elyra's shoulders, frowning. You have good bone structure, strong shoulders. We can work with this. The Eastern style you've been wearing is all wrong. Too soft, too accommodating. We need something that reads as power before you even speak. What does power look like? Katrine smiled for the first time. Like you could destroy someone and sleep soundly after. The assistants laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. They worked for hours. Pinning, draping, marking fabric with chalk, discussing necklines and sleeve lengths like military strategy. Because in courts like Vareth's, clothes were armor, and every choice was a weapon. At some point, Vaelor appeared in the doorway. The room went silent. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching the organized chaos with an expression Elyra couldn't read. How's the transformation progressing? Katrine didn't even pause in her work. She has good structure. The Eastern styling was hiding it. We're correcting that. His eyes found Elyra's in the mirror. You look exhausted. Your aunt spent the morning teaching me how to stand, and you survived. That's promising. He pushed off the doorframe. Walk with me when they're finished. It wasn't a request. Katrine made a dismissive gesture. We're done for today. Next fitting is in 4 days. Try not to lose or gain weight before then. The assistants packed up their supplies with practiced efficiency and disappeared like smoke. Elyra followed Vaelor into the corridor, still wearing the simple dress she'd arrived in. He set a pace that wasn't quite hurried but covered ground fast. She had to work to keep up. Where are we going? Somewhere you need to see. They went deeper into the palace, past the elegant public areas into sections that looked older, rougher. The marble gave way to bare stone. Torches replaced chandeliers. The air smelled like cold earth and old violence. Finally, Vaelor stopped before a heavy iron door. He pulled it open to reveal a room that made Elyra's breath catch. It was an armory, but not the decorative kind where nobles hung ancestral swords they'd never used. This was functional, brutal. Racks of weapons that showed wear from actual combat, armor pieces with dents and scorch marks, training dummies that had been cut to pieces and badly repaired. This is where I come when the weight of the crown gets too heavy. His voice echoed in the stone space. When the politics and the compromise and the endless manipulation make me want to burn the whole empire down and start over. He picked up a sword from the nearest rack. The blade was scarred but clean, well maintained despite obvious damage. You know what ruling actually is, Lady Elyra. It's not the grand speeches or the formal decrees, it's the 1,000 small compromises you make every day. The people you can't save because saving them costs more than the empire can afford. The alliances with monsters because the alternative monsters are worse. He set the sword down with careful precision. It's choosing who suffers so that more people don't suffer worse. And living with that choice every single day. Why are you telling me this? Vaelor turned to face her fully. Because you need to know what you're actually agreeing to. This isn't just about revenge on Cassian Thornvale. This isn't just about wearing a crown and making nobles bow. This is about becoming the kind of person who can make decisions that will haunt you and make them anyway because someone has to. The raw honesty of it was almost violent. Elyra met his eyes. You think I'm not strong enough? I think you're strong enough to survive what Thornvale did to you. I don't know if you're strong enough to survive what being empress will do to you. Then why offer me the position? Because surviving one doesn't guarantee surviving the other, but failing the first test means you'll definitely fail the second. You passed the first test. You walked out of that hall with your spine straight. Most people would have broken. She moved closer into the space most people instinctively kept between themselves and the king. Is that what you did? Break everyone around you until only the strong ones remained. Something dangerous flickered in his expression. No. I broke myself first. Repeatedly. Until the weak parts were burned away and only the pieces capable of ruling survived. The air between them felt charged, heavy. What weak parts? The ones that wanted to be loved instead of feared. The ones that cared more about being right than being effective. The ones that believed promises meant something. He said it without self-pity, just cold assessment. Elyra understood that language, the language of survival stripped down to its skeleton. What if I said I wasn't sure I wanted to become that? Then I'd respect your honesty and give you enough gold to disappear into a comfortable life somewhere far from here. His voice didn't change, but you wouldn't be asking the question if you hadn't already decided. How do you know? Because you're still here. Because you stood in front of that mirror for 3 hours learning to hold yourself differently. Because when Katrine and her assistants treated you like raw material to be shaped, you didn't flinch. You measured them right back. He stepped closer, and suddenly Elyra was aware of how much space he took up, not from size alone, from presence, from the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. You want this. You want it more than safety, more than comfort, maybe even more than revenge, though revenge is a decent secondary motivation. What makes you so certain? Because I recognize hunger when I see it, the kind that doesn't go away just because you feed it, the kind that only grows sharper. The words landed like an accusation and a recognition all at once. Elyra refused to step back. And what happens when two hungry people share power? Vaelor's smile was sharp as broken glass. Either we build something strong enough to hold us both, or we destroy each other trying. There's no middle ground. Then we better build something strong. Good answer. He walked toward the door, then paused. My aunt is brutal, but she's the best teacher you'll find. Listen to everything she tells you, learn it, master it. Because 6 weeks isn't long, and the court will be looking for any excuse to tear you apart. And you. Will you be looking for excuses too? His expression went cold in a way that should have been frightening, but underneath the ice, Elyra caught something else. Something almost like respect. I'm counting on you being too dangerous to tear apart. Don't disappoint me. He left. Elyra stood alone in the armory, surrounded by weapons and old violence, feeling something settle in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well. This was the reality. She wasn't marrying a man. She was entering a partnership with someone equally damaged, equally driven, equally willing to sacrifice softness for survival. And somehow that honesty was more solid than anything Cassian had ever offered her. Because lies dressed up as love were more dangerous than truth acknowledged as transaction. At least this way, she knew exactly what she was trading. Her old self for a new one. Comfort for power. The possibility of being cherished for the certainty of being essential. She picked up the sword Vaelor had held. It was heavier than expected. The balance was off, weighted for someone with more upper body strength than she currently had. But she held it anyway, felt the cold metal against her palm, and made herself a second promise to match the first. She would become someone who could wield weapons like this without flinching, someone who could make impossible choices without breaking, someone who could stand beside a king without being consumed by his shadow, even if it meant burning away every soft part of herself until only iron remained. The days blurred together after that. Mornings with Sarastra, learning the brutal etiquette of court hierarchy. How to insult someone with such politeness they couldn't object without looking petty. How to form alliances with people who hated you by finding their pressure points and applying just enough leverage. how to smile like you knew secrets while revealing nothing, afternoons with various tutors, military strategy, economic policy, the complex web of noble houses and their interconnected grievances spanning generations, tax structures, trade agreements, border disputes that had been simmering since before she was born, evenings alone, memorizing everything, her head pounding from information overload and her body aching from the constant tension of holding herself differently. She saw Vaelor rarely, brief encounters in corridors, once at a formal dinner where he barely acknowledged her beyond a nod. The message was clear. This was not a romance. This was preparation for a role, and they were both professionals taking it seriously. Fine by her. She didn't need his attention. She needed his empire. On the 10th day, Sarastra brought her to a small sitting room overlooking the eastern valleys. Today we practiced the art of devastating honesty. Elyra had learned not to question the dowager's lessons. She sat and waited. Sarastra poured tea with those precise, economical movements. You're learning quickly. Your posture has improved. Your voice carries better. You're memorizing houses and alliances faster than I expected, but you're still performing. Stand. Everything you're doing feels like a costume you're wearing, like you're pretending to be the kind of woman who can stand beside Vaelor. The dowager's eyes were sharp as flint. Pretending works for a while, but courts like ours can smell performance. They'll test you until the mask cracks, and then they'll destroy you. So what do I do? Stop pretending, become it. And the only way to become it is to face the truth about why you're really here. Elyra's jaw tightened. I'm here because Cassian betrayed me and Vaelor offered me power. That's the story you're telling yourself. It's not the whole truth. Then what is? Sarastra leaned forward. You're here because you spent your entire life watching people with less intelligence and more inheritance take things you deserved. You're here because you're tired of being useful without being valued. You're here because some part of you has always believed you were meant for more than being some mediocre lord's competent shadow. The words hit like physical blows. And you're terrified. Not of the court, not of the politics. You're terrified that you'll reach the top and discover you're still not enough. That even with the crown and the power and the victory over everyone who dismissed you, there will still be some hollow space inside that nothing fills. Elyra's hands clenched in her lap. You don't know me well enough to make those assumptions. I don't need to know you. I know the hunger. I had it too. The dowager's voice went quieter. I married into this family 40 years ago, a merchant's daughter who'd clawed her way into minor nobility through trade connections and strategic marriages. Every aristocrat in Vareth looked at me like I was dirt pretending to be gold. She paused, and something ancient moved behind her eyes. I spent 20 years proving I was more dangerous than all of them combined. I outlived my husband, raised Vaelor after his parents died, destroyed 3 different houses that tried to seize power during the Regency. And you know what I discovered at the end of it? What? That the hunger never goes away. You just learn to use it as fuel instead of letting it consume you. Silence filled the space between them. Outside, birds called to each other across the valleys. Sarastra's voice came back measured and hard. So stop performing, girl. Stop trying to be what you think an empress should be. Find the part of you that's angry and hungry and absolutely done apologizing for wanting more. Make that your foundation. Build everything else on top of it. How? By admitting what you actually want, not the polite version, the real version. Elyra felt something crack open in her chest. Dangerous, true. I want everyone who watched me get discarded to choke on their assumptions. I want Cassian to see me wearing the crown and know he traded away the best thing he ever had. I want nobles who spent years looking through me to bow. I want power that no one can take away. Keep going. I want to matter. I want to shape the world instead of just surviving in it. I want to be the kind of woman people remember centuries after she's dead. The dowager smiled. That's the foundation. Now we build the empress on top of it. Chets, 3 weeks in, everything changed. Elyra woke to shouting in the corridors outside her rooms. She grabbed a robe and opened the door to find guards rushing past, weapons drawn. One stopped long enough to bark at her. Stay in your quarters. Lock the door. What's happening? Assassination attempt. The king is handling it. He ran off before she could ask more. Elyra stood frozen in the doorway, while her mind raced through possibilities. Who? The Ash Dominion. A rival house. Someone Vaelor had made an enemy through his brutal efficiency. Did it matter? She went back inside but didn't lock the door. Instead, she dressed quickly in the plainest clothes she could find and pulled her hair back. If the palace was under attack, hiding in her room like a decorative burden was exactly what weak empresses did. She'd be damned if she started now. The corridors were chaos. Guards everywhere. Servants pressed against walls trying to stay invisible. Somewhere deeper in the palace, she heard the crash of steel on steel. She moved toward the sound. A guard tried to stop her. Lady Elyra, you need to return to your rooms. Where is the king? Being protected. As you should be. She stepped around him. If I'm going to be empress, I need to see what threats look like. Get out of my way or escort me. Your choice. The guard stared at her for 3 seconds, then made a decision. Follow me. Stay close. They went deeper into the palace, toward the old stone sections. The sounds of fighting grew louder. They rounded a corner and stopped. Vaelor stood in the center of a circular chamber, surrounded by 4 bodies and still fighting 2 remaining attackers. Blood streaked his face and arms. His movements were economical, brutal, nothing wasted. One attacker lunged. Vaelor sidestepped and drove a blade up under the man's ribs with surgical precision. The body dropped. The last attacker hesitated. That hesitation cost him. Vaelor closed the distance and ended it. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. The king stood among the dead, breathing hard, holding a sword that dripped red on the stone floor. Then he turned and saw Elyra standing in the corridor entrance. His expression went through 3 different emotions, too fast to name, landing on fury. What in hell are you doing here, seeing what trying to kill you looks like? He crossed the space between them in 5 strides. I gave orders for you to stay in your quarters. I don't take orders well. You should probably know that about me. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. This isn't a game. Those men came to kill me. If they'd found you instead, they didn't. And if they had, I wouldn't have been a decorative target waiting to get slaughtered. What would you have been? She held his gaze. Someone who fought back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Blood dripped from his sword onto the stone floor. Around them, guards flooded the chamber, securing the bodies, checking for more threats. Vaelor's voice dropped low enough that only she could hear. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most reckless. Can it be both? His laugh was harsh and genuine. Get back to your quarters, now, before I have you locked there for your own protection. You won't. Test me. She smiled. Not today. You're already dealing with enough bodies. She turned and walked away, spine straight, refusing to hurry. Behind her, she heard him say something to the guards. His voice carried a note she hadn't heard before, almost like respect. On. That night, he came to her quarters. No warning. Just a knock, then the door opening, then Vaelor standing in her sitting room still wearing blood-stained clothes. Elyra looked up from the book she'd been failing to read. You know, most kings send invitations before visiting. Most nobles have enough self-preservation to stay locked in their rooms during assassination attempts. She set the book aside. Are you here to lecture me about taking unnecessary risks? No. He moved deeper into the room. I'm here because you did something today that I didn't expect. What? You walked toward danger instead of away from it. Seemed like the practical choice. If assassins were hunting you, I needed to know if they'd succeed. My future depends on yours now. Practical. His smile was sharp. That's one word for it. Reckless is another. You would have done the same. I'm trained for it. I've spent 30 years in combat. You're a noblewoman who was taught to negotiate and smile and make yourself useful in drawing rooms. Was. Past tense. She stood to face him fully. That's not who I am anymore. And who are you now? Someone who refuses to survive by hiding while other people determine her fate. The air between them changed, became something heavier. Vaelor studied her with those cold, calculating eyes that saw through every pretense. You know what the problem is with people like us? People like us. Survivors, we recognize each other, and once we do, we either become allies or enemies. There's no neutral ground. Which are we? He stepped closer, still deciding. Elyra didn't retreat. What would make you decide? Evidence. That you can handle the worst parts of this life without breaking. That you understand power costs blood and sleep and pieces of your soul, and you're willing to pay anyway. I walked toward assassination today. What more evidence do you need? That wasn't calculation. That was instinct. He was close enough now that she could see the scar that ran through his left eyebrow. Instinct is useful, but ruling requires choosing the hard path when every instinct screams to run. Show me the hard path, then. Let me prove I can walk it. Something shifted in his expression. A decision made. Tomorrow. We go to the northern prisons. There's a situation that needs handling. You'll come with me. You'll watch. And afterward, you'll tell me if you still want this life. What kind of situation? The kind that shows you what justice actually looks like when you're responsible for an empire. Not the clean version they teach in philosophy lessons. The real version. And if I can't handle it, then we end this arrangement before the wedding. No shame, no judgment. I'll give you enough gold to live comfortably elsewhere. And if I can, then I'll stop questioning whether you're strong enough and start treating you like the partner this empire needs. He left before she could respond. Elyra stood alone in her quarters, heart pounding, knowing she'd just agreed to some kind of test she didn't fully understand. But here's what she did understand. This was the point of no return. Tomorrow she'd see whatever darkness lived at the heart of ruling, and she'd either survive it or she wouldn't. There was no middle ground, no safe retreat, just the choice between becoming someone who could walk through hell without flinching or admitting she wasn't built for this life after all. She looked out the window at the capital below, at the 1,000 lights burning in the darkness. All those people, all those lives depending on whoever held power to make choices they couldn't make themselves. And tomorrow, she'd discover if she had the spine to be one of the people making those impossible choices, or if she was just another noblewoman playing at power until reality called her bluff. The northern prison sat carved into mountain stone like a mouthful of broken teeth. Elyra had seen sketches and historical texts, architectural diagrams showing cells and corridors, clean lines on parchment that suggested order and containment. Reality was colder. The carriage ride took 3 hours through terrain that got progressively bleaker. Pine forests gave way to rocky slopes. Villages became sparse, then disappeared entirely. By the time they reached the prison complex, the only signs of civilization were the guard towers and the smoke rising from what she assumed were furnaces. Vaelor sat across from her in silence for most of the journey. He'd changed into practical traveling clothes, dark and unremarkable. No crown, no royal insignia. Just a man who looked like he'd spent time in harder places than palaces. Finally, he spoke. What we're about to see isn't pretty. I didn't ask for pretty. I asked to understand what ruling actually costs. Understanding and witnessing are different things. His eyes held hers. You can know intellectually that justice sometimes looks like cruelty. It's different when you watch it happen and have to decide if you can live with being the person who ordered it. She refused to look away. What's waiting in there? A choice between protecting the empire and protecting your ability to sleep at night. The carriage stopped. Guards opened the door, and cold mountain air flooded in, carrying the smell of stone and something else. Something organic and wrong that made her stomach turn. Vaelor stepped out first, then offered his hand. She took it. The prison warden met them at the main gate. A woman named Helith with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She bowed to Vaelor with practiced efficiency. Your Majesty, the prisoner is secured in the lower interrogation chamber as requested. Any complications? He tried to bargain, offered information about other cells in exchange for clemency. Vaelor's expression didn't change. And you told him that clemency isn't my decision to make. Good. They followed Helith through corridors that got progressively darker and colder. Torchlight flickered against damp stone walls. Somewhere deeper in the complex, someone screamed. The sound cut off abruptly. Elyra kept her breathing steady, kept her spine straight, kept her expression neutral, even as everything inside her wanted to turn around and run back to the surface. This was the test, not the prison itself. The willingness to walk deeper into darkness when every instinct said, stop. They descended stairs that seemed to go on forever, down into sections of the prison that felt older than the kingdom itself, places where the stone remembered violence going back centuries. Finally, Helith stopped before a heavy door reinforced with iron. The prisoner's name is Torvald Wren. Vaelor's voice was flat. 6 weeks ago, he led a coordinated attack on 3 supply convoys carrying food to border villages. 37 people died, mostly civilians. He did it to create chaos, to destabilize the region, to prove the crown couldn't protect its own people. And you caught him. We caught him. Along with evidence linking him to the Ash Dominion and 2 noble houses who've been funding insurgency in the northern provinces. Elyra looked at the door. What happens now? Now you watch what happens when someone attacks the Empire's ability to feed its people. And afterward, you tell me if you can authorize this kind of justice when it becomes necessary. Helith opened the door. The room beyond was exactly what nightmares were built from. Stone walls slick with moisture. A single chair bolted to the floor in the center, and chained to that chair, a man who'd clearly been there for days. Torvald Wren looked maybe 40. Hard to tell through the bruising and exhaustion. His clothes were torn, his face swollen, and his eyes held the kind of desperate defiance that comes from knowing you've lost but refusing to admit it. 2 guards stood in the corners, silent, waiting. Vaelor walked to stand directly in front of the prisoner. Torvald Wren, you've been found guilty of coordinating attacks on civilian supply lines. 37 dead. Hundreds more would have starved if those convoys hadn't been replaced. What do you have to say? The prisoner spat blood on the floor. That you're a tyrant holding this empire together through fear. That people are tired of bowing to a king who treats them like pieces on a strategy board. That the old families remember when power was distributed properly, not concentrated in the hands of one man who thinks he's better than everyone else. His voice was hoarse but strong, convinced. Vaelor's expression didn't change. You killed people to make a political statement. I killed collaborators. People who accepted your authority instead of fighting it. They were farmers, merchants, families trying to survive winter. They chose their side. The casual dismissal of those deaths made something cold settle in Elyra's chest. This wasn't a man fighting for principle. This was someone who'd decided other people's lives were acceptable losses in service to his vision of how power should work. Vaelor turned to look at Elyra, Empress-to-be. You've heard the crime. You've seen the evidence in the documents I provided during the journey. You've listened to his justification. What's your judgment? The room went silent. Every eye turned to her. This was it, the test, not just whether she could stomach violence, but whether she could authorize it. Whether she could look at a situation with no good answers and make the choice that protected the most people even if it damned her conscience. Elyra studied Torvald Wren, looked past the bruising and chains to the man underneath. He met her eyes with hatred. She spoke carefully. If we show mercy, release you with exile or imprisonment, what happens? The Ash Dominion grows stronger, more attacks, more dead civilians, more chaos. Vaelor's voice was matter-of-fact. Because mercy becomes proof that the crown is weak, that you can kill imperial citizens and walk away. Every insurgent cell across Vareth will see it as permission to escalate. And if we execute him, we send a message. Attack civilian targets, face absolute consequences. It won't stop everyone, but it stops some. It saves lives by making the cost of violence too high to pay. Elyra's hands clenched at her sides. There's no good choice here. No. That's what ruling is, choosing between bad and worse, and living with knowing you could have chosen differently. She looked at Torvald again, at this man who'd killed farmers and called it revolution, and she made her choice. Execute him, publicly. Make sure every house funding insurgency knows exactly what happens when you target civilians. The prisoner's expression twisted. You're monsters, both of you. Vaelor's voice was cold as winter stone. We're the people who keep this empire from tearing itself apart. The difference matters. He nodded to the guards. Helith stepped forward. It will be done at dawn tomorrow in the central square. Public viewing as requested. Vaelor turned toward the door. We're finished here. They left Torvald Wren chained in that dark room, shouting curses that faded as they climbed back toward daylight. Elyra walked in silence, her mind replaying the moment of decision, the weight of it. The knowledge that she'd just ordered a man's death and the Empire would carry it out in her name. They emerged into late afternoon sunlight that felt obscene after the darkness below. Vaelor stopped beside the carriage. You're shaking. She looked down at her hands. They trembled slightly. I just sentenced someone to die. Yes. I thought it would feel different. How did you think it would feel? Like a choice I could take back. Like something I could undo if I changed my mind. And now it feels permanent. Like I crossed a line that rewrites who I am. He studied her with those calculating eyes. Do you regret it? She forced herself to answer honestly. No. He killed 37 people. He'd kill more if given the chance. But I hate that I don't regret it. Good. Vaelor's voice softened fractionally. The day you stop hating the necessity of violence is the day you become the kind of ruler who uses it casually. Hold on to that hate. Let it make you careful about when and how you authorize force. Is that what you do? Every time. They rode back to the capital in silence. But something had changed between them. Some barrier had fallen away. Because Elyra had seen the worst parts of ruling and hadn't run, had made the hard choice and lived with the weight of it. She'd proven she could walk through darkness without breaking. And Vaelor had shown her the truth behind his cold authority. That it wasn't cruelty. It was the ruthless mathematics of choosing who suffers so that more people don't suffer worse. Understanding that didn't make it easier, but it made it honest. 4 weeks before the midwinter convocation, Elyra stood in the palace courtyard watching soldiers drill in the pre-dawn cold. Their movements were precise, economical, brutal. The kind of discipline that came from knowing your life depended on not making mistakes. She'd started coming here every morning after the prison visit. Watching, learning, understanding that power ultimately rested on the willingness of people with weapons to enforce it. A voice interrupted her observation, admiring the view or planning a coup. She turned to find Sarastra wrapped in furs against the morning chill. Learning. There's a difference. Good. The dowager moved to stand beside her. You've changed since the northern prisons. How? You stand differently, move differently. There's a weight to you now that wasn't there before. Is that good or bad? Depends on whether you let it make you strong or let it crush you. Sarastra's voice was thoughtful. Most people who see what you saw either break immediately or break slowly over years. You're still standing. That's worth noting. I ordered a man's death. You ordered justice for 37 innocent people who didn't have the power to protect themselves. The dowager's tone was firm. Don't romanticize Torvald Wren into some kind of martyr. He made choices. Those choices had consequences. You enforce those consequences. That's ruling. It still feels wrong. It should. The day it feels right is the day you need to step down. They watched the soldiers in silence for several minutes. Then Sarastra spoke again. There's something you need to know. A situation developing in the Eastern Territories. Elyra's attention sharpened. What kind of situation? The kind involving your former betrothed. Cassian Thornvale has been making moves, quiet ones, building alliances with houses that have historically opposed the crown. That's not illegal, no. But the pattern suggests he's preparing something larger, and the timing is suspicious. 3 weeks before your public presentation as empress. Elyra's mind raced through possibilities. He wants to disrupt the wedding. Or worse, create enough chaos that Vaelor has to choose between dealing with Eastern instability and presenting you to court. Put him in a position where the marriage looks like a liability. Why would he risk that? Cassian got what he wanted. The Harrow Alliance, legitimacy. What does he gain by attacking me now? Sarastra's smile was grim. You underestimate how much certain men hate being proven wrong. He threw you away believing you were disposable. Now you're about to become empress. That makes him look like the fool who traded gold for copper. Some men can't live with that kind of public failure. What's Vaelor doing about it? Watching, gathering evidence, waiting for Cassian to overreach so we can break him legally instead of just suspiciously. Elyra felt cold settle in her bones that had nothing to do with the morning air. How bad could this get? The dowager met her eyes. Bad enough that you need to be ready for anything. Cassian is weak, but weak men backed into corners become dangerous, especially when they have resources and old grudges. Tell me what I need to do. Keep training, keep learning, and when the moment comes, be ready to show every noble in that convocation hall that you're not the woman Cassian discarded. You're the one he was never strong enough to keep. 3 weeks before the convocation, Elyra woke to pounding on her door in the dead of night. She grabbed a robe and opened it to find guards, and Sarastra, the dowager's face tight with controlled fury. Get dressed. Now. The king needs you in the war room. What happened? Your education in treachery is about to accelerate. Move. 5 minutes later, Elyra entered the war room to find Vaelor standing over a table covered in maps and documents, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. Cassian Thornvale just made his move. She stopped beside him. What did he do? He leaked documents to 6 major noble houses claiming that our marriage is a political sham, that I'm using you to consolidate power while planning to set you aside after producing an heir, that you're nothing but a convenient tool I picked up after he discarded you. The words hit like physical blows. Vaelor continued, voice tight with controlled rage. He's framing it as concern for your well-being, suggesting that you're being manipulated into a loveless political arrangement by a king who sees you as disposable, and he's offering himself as proof that you have a pattern of choosing men who use you. The vicious cleverness of it made Elyra's stomach turn. He's trying to make me look weak, like I'm being traded between powerful men instead of making my own choices. Worse, Sarastra's voice cut through the room. He's giving every house that opposes the crown a narrative to rally around. The tragic noblewoman being exploited by the tyrant king. It plays into every fear about concentrated power and every resentment about Vaelor's reforms. How bad is the damage? 7 houses have already sent formal inquiries asking for clarification about the nature of the marriage. 4 more are making noise about requiring proof that you're entering this arrangement willingly. Elyra's mind raced. This is brilliant, twisted, but brilliant. If I defend myself too strongly, I look like I'm protesting too much. If I say nothing, the silence becomes confirmation. Exactly. Vaelor's jaw was tight. And if we crack down too hard on Cassian, we prove we're the tyrants he's painting us as. So what do we do? The room went silent. Everyone looked at her. Vaelor spoke carefully. That depends on whether you're willing to fight back using his own weapons. Meaning we expose him, publicly. Show every house exactly what kind of man Cassian Thornvale actually is. The gambling debts he hid from the Harrows, the territorial claims he falsified, the way he took credit for your political work for 3 years. We destroy his credibility so completely that anything he says about you becomes suspect, and the cost. We turn your personal humiliation into public spectacle. Every noble in Vareth will know the details of how he used you and discarded you. Your private pain becomes entertainment. Elyra felt something twist in her chest. You're asking me to weaponize my own humiliation. I'm asking you to use the truth as a blade. Sarastra's voice was hard. Cassian is counting on you being too proud or too damaged to revisit that night publicly. Prove him wrong, and if I refuse, then we handle this through traditional power channels. It'll work eventually, but it'll leave questions about your agency, your strength, your ability to stand beside Vaelor as an equal. The weight of the choice pressed down like a physical thing. This was what ruling cost, not just ordering executions in dark prisons, but taking your deepest wounds and displaying them like battle scars because the Empire needed you to be strong in public even when you were breaking in private. Elyra looked at the documents spread across the table, at the evidence of Cassian's manipulation, at the choice between protecting her dignity and protecting her future. Then she made her decision. Do it. Expose everything, every lie he told, every credit he stole, every promise he broke. Make him regret ever thinking I was too weak to fight back. Vaelor's expression shifted, something like respect mixed with concern. This will hurt. Good. Let it hurt. Let everyone see exactly what he did and exactly what I survived, because the woman he discarded isn't the same one standing here now. The dowager smiled sharp as broken glass. Now you're thinking like an empress. They worked through the night, building the case, organizing evidence, crafting the narrative that would be released to every major house simultaneously. By dawn, Elyra had reviewed documents she'd tried to forget. Correspondence, where Cassian took credit for her negotiations. Witness statements from servants who'd watched him treat her like useful furniture. Financial records showing how he'd gambled with funds she'd helped him secure. Every page was a reminder of how thoroughly she'd been used, and every page became ammunition. 7 days later, the information flooded Vareth's political circles like poison in a water supply. The response was immediate and brutal. Houses that had supported Cassian suddenly withdrew backing. The Harrows sent formal inquiry into whether their daughter's marriage contract had been entered under false pretenses. Lords who'd questioned Vaelor's choice of empress went silent as the evidence showed exactly what kind of man had been stupid enough to throw Elyra away. And Cassian Thornvale's reputation collapsed like a building with rotten foundations. Elyra watched it happen from the palace, feeling nothing like triumph, just cold satisfaction that he was finally experiencing the consequences of his own choices. But then the message arrived. A courier brought it directly to her quarters, sealed with Cassian's personal mark. She broke the seal with hands that didn't shake and read words that made her blood freeze. "You've won this round. Congratulations. But you should know that everything I did with backing from people who matter more than you realize. The Ash Dominion isn't just some scattered insurgency. It's organized, funded, and it's been inside the palace walls longer than you've been alive. One of Vaelor's closest advisors is ours, has been for years. When you figure out who, it'll already be too late. Enjoy your wedding, Empress." The letter wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Elyra stared at the words until they blurred, her mind racing through implications. A traitor. Inside the inner circle. Someone close enough to Vaelor to do real damage. And Cassian knew about it, which meant he'd been working with the Ash Dominion from the beginning. His betrayal of her hadn't been just personal weakness. It had been part of something larger. She should go to Vaelor immediately, show him the letter, sound the alarm. But something stopped her. If there was a traitor that close to the king, telling the wrong person could trigger whatever plan was already in motion, could accelerate the timeline, could put Vaelor in more danger than he was already facing. She needed to figure out who before raising any alarms. Needed to be certain. Elyra walked to the window and looked out over the capital as evening painted the sky, blood red. Somewhere in the palace, someone was feeding information to the Empire's enemies. Someone Vaelor trusted enough to keep close. Someone who'd been playing both sides long enough to remain undiscovered. And she had less than 3 weeks to identify them before the midwinter convocation brought every major house to Nightspire. Before whatever plan was in motion reached its conclusion. Before the wedding made her empress of an empire that might already be compromised from within. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like iron. This was the real test. Not walking through dark prisons, not ordering executions, not even enduring public humiliation. This was about protecting Vaelor from threats he couldn't see. About becoming the kind of partner who could watch his back when he was too busy watching the Empire. About proving she wasn't just someone who could survive beside him, but someone who could keep him alive when enemies got too close. Elyra burned the letter in her fireplace and watched the paper curl into ash. Then she began making a list of everyone in Vaelor's inner circle. Everyone who had access to sensitive information. Everyone who'd been present during key decisions over the past year. Everyone who could be the traitor hiding in plain sight. The list was longer than she wanted it to be. And every name on it was someone the king trusted with his life. Which meant Elyra was about to discover that the deadliest betrayals weren't the obvious ones. They were the ones that came from people you'd never thought to suspect. People who smiled in your face while sharpening knives behind your back. People who knew exactly where to strike to make the wound fatal. She had 3 weeks to find them. 3 weeks to save a king who didn't know he needed saving. 3 weeks to prove she was more than just the woman Cassian had discarded. She was the one who'd become dangerous enough to walk into the fire and drag the truth out by its throat, even if the truth burned her alive in the process. 20 days before the midwinter convocation, Elyra spent every waking hour watching. Not obviously. That would tip her hand to whoever was feeding information to the Ash Dominion. Instead, she moved through the palace like she was still just learning her role, attending council meetings, sitting in on military briefings, observing diplomatic sessions with visiting houses. But her real education was happening in the margins. Who left rooms too quickly after sensitive discussions? Who asked questions that seemed innocent but probed too deeply into security arrangements? Who had access to information that later showed up in enemy hands? The list of suspects narrowed slowly, painfully. Lord Commander Arctis, military strategist who'd served Vaelor for 15 years. Brilliant tactician with intimate knowledge of every defensive weakness in the Empire. Chancellor Morvain, economic advisor who controlled trade policy and had connections to every major house, including the ones funding insurgency. Lady Tessara, diplomatic envoy who negotiated with foreign powers and moved through enemy territory with suspicious ease. And Sarastra. That name made Elyra's stomach turn every time she wrote it down. The Dowager had access to everything, knowledge of every secret, trust that went back decades. If Sarastra was the traitor, then the entire foundation Elyra had been building was compromised. But suspicion without evidence was just paranoia. She needed proof. On the 14th day, she found it. Late at night, unable to sleep, Elyra walked the palace corridors that had become familiar through weeks of exploration. She'd learned the rhythm of guard rotations, the patterns of servants moving between sections, the quiet hours when the palace breathed differently. She was passing the East Wing administrative offices when she heard voices. Low, urgent, coming from Chancellor Morvain's private study. Elyra pressed herself against the wall and moved closer. The door was cracked open maybe an inch, enough to hear but not see clearly. Morvain's voice carried through the gap. The timeline has moved up. 3 weeks isn't enough. We need to act during the wedding ceremony itself. A second voice responded. Male. Unfamiliar. The Ash Dominion isn't ready. Our forces in the capital number less than 200. That's not enough to take the palace. It's enough to create chaos. Morvain's tone was sharp. We don't need to hold the palace. We just need to kill Vaelor and the girl. Make it look like the Harrows were behind it. Turn the noble houses against each other while the Dominion moves into the power vacuum. And if we fail, then we die. But the old families will still fracture. The empire will still collapse. That's all that matters. Silence. Then the second voice again, quieter. You're certain Vaelor suspects nothing. He's too focused on the wedding and the eastern houses. By the time he realizes the threat is inside his own walls, it'll be too late. Elyra's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain they could hear it. Morvain, the economic advisor who sat in every council meeting, who had Vaelor's complete trust, who'd helped Elyra navigate trade policy for weeks with patient explanations. He was the traitor, and he was planning to assassinate them both during the wedding. She needed to move, needed to get this information to Vaelor immediately. But her foot caught on uneven stone. The sound was small, but in the silence of the corridor it was deafening. The voices inside the study stopped. Elyra ran. Behind her, the door slammed open. Footsteps pounded after her. She knew these corridors better than most, but Morvain had decades of experience in the palace, and whoever was with him sounded military trained. She rounded a corner toward the main halls where guards would be stationed. A hand grabbed her arm and yanked her sideways into an alcove. She opened her mouth to scream. Vaelor's hand covered it. His eyes were ice and fury in the darkness. Not a sound. Behind them, the footsteps slowed, searching. Morvain's voice echoed through the corridor. Whoever that was is going to die tonight. Find them. Vaelor's grip on her arm was iron tight. He pulled her deeper into the alcove, into a hidden passage she hadn't known existed. They moved through darkness, his hand guiding her, until they emerged in what looked like a storage room 3 corridors away. Only then did he release her. What in hell were you doing in the East Wing at midnight? She was breathing hard, adrenaline making her voice shake, following a suspicion. I know who the traitor is. His expression went absolutely still. Talk. She told him everything. The letter from Cassian, her investigation, what she'd just overheard in Morvain's study. Vaelor listened without interrupting, his face getting darker with every word. When she finished, the silence was terrifying. Then he spoke, and his voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. You've been investigating a traitor in my inner circle for 2 weeks and didn't tell me. You couldn't risk trusting me. He stepped closer, and suddenly the small room felt suffocating. You decided you knew better than the person who's been ruling this empire for 20 years. You played spy instead of partner, because I didn't know who to trust. The words came out harsher than intended. For all I knew, telling the wrong person would have gotten us both killed. So you trusted no one, including me. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Elyra forced herself to meet his eyes. I was trying to protect you, by keeping me in the dark about a conspiracy to murder me during my own wedding. His laugh was bitter. That's not protection. That's arrogance disguised as care. The anger in his voice sparked her own. You want to talk about arrogance? You're the one who brought me into this empire and then left me to figure out the rules alone. You're the one who tested me with dark prisons and brutal choices without explaining what I was actually walking into. You don't get to lecture me about partnership when you've been treating this entire arrangement like a strategic calculation. Because it is a strategic calculation. That's what I told you from the beginning. This isn't a fairy tale. This is survival. And I survived. I found your traitor. I got you information that's going to save both our lives. And instead of being grateful, you're angry that I didn't ask permission first. Vaelor's jaw clenched. You don't understand what you've done. Then explain it to me. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. You made yourself a target. Morvayn knows someone overheard. He knows his timeline is compromised, which means he's going to accelerate whatever plan is in motion. And he's going to come for you first because you're the vulnerability. I can handle myself. Against a conspiracy that's been building for years. Against trained assassins and coordinated attacks. Against threats you don't even know exist yet. His eyes were fierce. You're brilliant, Elyra, but you're not invincible, and you just painted a target on your back that I can't protect. The fear underneath his anger finally registered. He wasn't furious that she'd investigated without him. He was terrified that she'd put herself in danger, and that realization shifted everything. Her voice came out quieter. What do we do now? Now we move up our own timeline. Vaelor's expression hardened into something absolutely ruthless. We can't wait for the convocation. We need to root out every Ash Dominion sympathizer in the palace tonight, before Morvayn has time to regroup. How? By making them think they've already won. Medicine. Vaelor called an emergency council meeting within the hour. Every major advisor, every military commander, every person with access to sensitive Imperial information. They gathered in the war room, looking confused and concerned. Morvayn arrived last, his expression perfectly composed. If he was worried about being discovered, he hid it flawlessly. Vaelor stood at the head of the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. We have intelligence that the Ash Dominion is planning a major attack during the midwinter convocation. They intend to assassinate key members of the royal family and create chaos that will fracture the empire. Around the table, faces registered shock, horror, anger. Morvayn's expression was concern so genuine it would have fooled anyone who didn't know better. Your Majesty, this is catastrophic. Do we know their timeline? Within 3 weeks, possibly sooner. Vaelor's eyes swept the room, which means we need to accelerate our defensive preparations. I want every entry point to the palace secured, every guest list vetted, every servant background checked. Lord Commander Arctis leaned forward. That will require significant military presence in the capital. It could look like we're preparing for war. Better to look aggressive than be dead. Vaelor's tone was flat. Chancellor Morvayn, I need you to coordinate with the city guard. Make sure supply lines are protected and civilian areas are secured. Morvayn nodded smoothly. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll begin immediately. Lady Tessara spoke up. Should we postpone the convocation entirely? If the threat is this serious? No. Vaelor cut her off. Postponing shows weakness. We proceed as planned. But we do it with every precaution in place. The meeting continued for another hour. Strategies were discussed. Resources allocated. Security measures outlined. Elyra sat in the corner, watching Morvayn's perfect performance. Watching how he volunteered for exactly the kind of coordination role that would give him access to all their defensive plans. Watching how smoothly he manipulated the conversation without anyone noticing. When the meeting finally ended and advisors filed out, Vaelor caught her eye. A single look that said, "Stay." They waited until the room was empty except for Arctis and Sarastra. Then Vaelor locked the door. The Lord Commander's expression shifted immediately. What's really happening? What's happening is we just gave our traitor exactly what he wanted. Vaelor's voice was grim. Complete access to our defensive strategy so he can dismantle it from within. Arctis went very still. You know who it is, Chancellor Morvayn, and he's working directly with the Ash Dominion to coordinate an attack during the wedding ceremony. Sarastra's face could have been carved from stone. You're certain. Elyra spoke for the first time. I overheard him planning it tonight, discussing timeline, strategy. The goal is to kill both of us and blame it on the Harrows to fracture the noble houses. The dowager's eyes went to Vaelor. Why haven't you arrested him? Because arresting him only gets us one traitor. Vaelor moved to the window overlooking the capital. We need the whole network, everyone he's working with, every Ash Dominion cell in the city. And the only way to get that is to make them think they're about to succeed. You're using yourselves as bait. Arctis's voice was flat. We're using the wedding as bait. Vaelor turned back to face them. We let Morvain think his plan is working. Let him coordinate his attack. And when they move, we crush the entire conspiracy at once. That's insane. Sarastra rarely raised her voice. You're risking both your lives on the assumption that you can control a coordinated assault by trained insurgents. We're risking our lives either way. At least this way we end the threat permanently instead of cutting off one head and watching two more grow back. And if something goes wrong, if they get past your defenses, if one assassin slips through. Vaelor's expression was absolutely cold. Then I die protecting the Empire from collapsing into chaos. That's what ruling means. The room went silent. Arctis finally spoke. What do you need from us? Complete secrecy. Vaelor's voice was steel. Morvain can't know we've identified him. We need to act like everything is normal while we prepare the real defenses. Can you do that? The Lord Commander nodded slowly. I can play ignorant, but I don't like it. You don't have to like it. You just have to be convincing, and me. Sarastra's eyes were hard. What's my role in this suicide plan? You protect Elyra. Vaelor looked at her with something that might have been desperation masked as command. When the attack comes, she's the primary target, because she's the variable they can't control. I need you to keep her alive no matter what. The dowager's gaze shifted to Elyra. The girl can handle herself better than you think. I know, but I need the certainty anyway. Sarastra studied them both for a long moment, then nodded once. Understood. They spent the next 3 hours planning. Real defenses versus the fake ones Morvain would be coordinating. Loyal guards versus potentially compromised ones. Escape routes. Fallback positions. Contingencies for every possible scenario. By the time the sun started rising over the capital, they had something that looked almost like a plan. Almost. Because the truth about plans involving life and death is that they're only as good as the first moment of contact with reality. After that, everything becomes improvisation and prayer. Elyra walked back to her quarters in the gray dawn light, exhaustion making her movements heavy. She'd exposed a conspiracy. She'd put herself directly in the path of coordinated assassins. She'd committed to a wedding that would double as a trap for enemies who wanted her dead. And in less than 3 weeks, she'd find out if she was strong enough to survive what came next, or if she'd finally found the limit of what one determined woman could endure. 14 days before the wedding, the palace became a stage where everyone performed normalcy while preparing for war. Morvain coordinated security with perfect efficiency, not knowing that every order he gave was being countered by Arctis's real preparations. Visiting nobles arrived for the convocation, completely unaware that half the servants vetting their credentials were intelligence operatives. And Elyra continued her training with Sarastra while trying not to think about the fact that she was being fitted for a wedding dress that might become her burial shroud. The final fitting happened 7 days before the ceremony. Katrine and her assistants had outdone themselves. The dress was black silk and silver threading. Not the soft white of traditional weddings, but something darker, more powerful. It looked like armor pretending to be elegance. Elyra stood in front of the mirror while they made final adjustments and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back had been forged through fire, hardened by impossible choices, sharpened by survival. She looked like an empress. Katrine stepped back with satisfaction. Perfect. You'll terrify every woman in that hall and make every man reconsider what power looks like, as long as I live long enough to walk down the aisle. The words came out before Elyra could stop them. The seamstress's expression didn't change. You'll live. You're too stubborn to die before making them all choke on their assumptions. After they left, Elyra stood alone in front of the mirror. 7 days. 7 days until she either survived the most dangerous gamble of her life or died trying. 7 days to prepare for a ceremony that was equal parts wedding and battlefield. 7 days to become invincible, or at least convincing enough that enemies would hesitate before attacking. That night, Vaelor came to her quarters. He didn't knock, just opened the door and walked in like he had every right. She looked up from the document she'd been studying. Breaking and entering is beneath a king. So is letting the woman I'm about to marry face assassins without checking that she's actually ready. I'm ready. Prove it. He moved across the room with that predatory grace she'd learned to recognize. Not threatening, just absolutely certain of his space in the world. Elyra stood to face him. What kind of proof do you want? Honesty. Are you scared? Terrified? Good. Fear keeps you sharp. He stopped close enough that she could see the scar through his eyebrow, the one she'd noticed weeks ago. Are you going to run? No. Why not? Because running would mean they win. Cashin wins. Morvain wins. Every person who thought I was disposable wins. And I'd rather die standing than live knowing I gave them that satisfaction. Something shifted in his expression. You know what the real tragedy is? Rulers who survive long enough all become the same kind of damaged. We learn to sacrifice pieces of ourselves until we're not sure what's left that's actually human. We make impossible choices and live with the consequences. We love people while knowing we'd sacrifice them if the empire required it. His voice dropped lower. And somewhere in all that necessary cruelty, we forget what it feels like to have someone stand beside us, not because they have to, but because they refuse to do anything else. Elyra's breath caught. Is that what I am to you? Someone who refuses to leave. You're someone who walked toward danger when everyone else ran away, who ordered an execution and hated that it was necessary, who investigated a conspiracy alone rather than trust anyone, including me. You're reckless and brilliant and absolutely terrifying. He reached up and touched her face with careful precision. And if you die in 7 days because I used you as bait for a trap, I will burn this entire empire down and salt the earth where it stood. The raw honesty of it was almost violent. Elyra leaned into his hand. Then I guess I better not die. You better not. He kissed her. Not like the desperate kiss in the snow after the ambush that had never happened in this timeline, but something deeper, more deliberate, a claim and a promise and a recognition all at once. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark. After this is over. After we've survived and crushed the conspiracy and secured the empire, we're going to have a conversation about what this actually is between us. And what is it? I don't know yet, but it's not just strategy anymore. He left before she could respond. Elyra stood alone in her quarters, fingers touching her lips, heart pounding. 7 days until the wedding. 7 days until assassins tried to kill them both. 7 days until she found out if she could survive long enough to have that conversation. The weight of it should have crushed her. Instead, it felt like clarity. Because here's what the world doesn't tell you about facing death. It strips away everything false, every pretense, every careful lie you tell yourself about who you are and what you want. When survival becomes uncertain, truth becomes the only currency that matters. And Elyra's truth was brutally simple. She wanted to live. Wanted to stand beside Vaelor and build something that lasted. Wanted to prove that the woman Cassian discarded was strong enough to reshape an empire. And she would fight through hell itself to make that happen. 3 days before the wedding. The first attempt came during a routine diplomatic meeting. Elyra was reviewing trade agreements with visiting merchants when one of them moved wrong. Too fast. Too purposeful. She saw the blade half a second before it would have buried itself in her throat. Instinct took over. She threw herself sideways. The knife missed by inches and embedded in the chair where her neck had been. Guards flooded the room within seconds. The merchant was dead before they could question him. Poison capsule hidden in his mouth. The kind serious assassins carried when capture wasn't an option. Vaelor arrived while they were still securing the scene. His face was absolutely white beneath the surface control. He looked at the knife, at the dead assassin, at Elyra standing there with adrenaline shaking through her limbs. Then he grabbed her arm and pulled her into a side corridor away from witnesses. You're done attending public meetings? No. That wasn't a request. And I'm not a decorative prisoner to be locked away for safety. Her voice was steel. They're testing defenses, trying to rattle us. If I hide, it proves we're scared. You should be scared. That blade was 3 inches from your throat. But it missed, and now we know they're desperate enough to try in broad daylight. That's useful information. His grip on her arm tightened. Information isn't worth your life. Yes, it is. Because if I die, you still have an empire to protect. But if you spend resources keeping me safe instead of securing the real threats, we both die and the empire collapses. The brutal logic of it made his expression go dark. Don't ask me to choose between protecting you and protecting Vareth. I'm not asking. I'm telling you the choice is already made. We protect Vareth, together, or we fail together. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then he kissed her hard enough to bruise. When he pulled back, his voice was rough. 3 days, survive 3 more days. Then we end this. I'll survive 30 if that's what it takes. Promise me. She met his eyes. I promise. He left her there, and she could see the war happening inside him. The king who'd spent 20 years learning not to love anything more than duty fighting against something that wanted to prioritize her survival above everything else. That was the real danger of their arrangement, not the assassins or the conspiracy, but the fact that somewhere between political calculation and survival, they'd started caring about each other more than was safe for people who ruled empires. Because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability in their world meant death. The night before the wedding, Elyra couldn't sleep. She walked the palace corridors one final time, memorizing escape routes and defensive positions. Arctis had done everything possible to secure the ceremony location. Loyal guards at every entrance, weapons caches hidden in strategic locations, contingency plans layered so deep that even if half of them failed, they'd still have options. But plans were just paper promises. Reality would test them with steel and blood. She found herself in the armory where Vaelor had first shown her the cost of ruling. The sword still hung on the walls, scarred from actual combat, maintained despite obvious damage. She picked up the same blade she'd held weeks ago, still too heavy, still weighted wrong for her frame, but she'd been practicing. Sarastra had insisted, if you're going to stand in the middle of an attack, you need to know how to fight back. So Elyra had learned, not perfectly, not with the skill of someone who'd trained their whole life, but enough to be dangerous if cornered, enough to refuse helplessness. A voice interrupted her thoughts. You should be resting. She turned to find Sarastra in the doorway. The dowager entered and moved to stand beside her, looking at the weapons with an expression Elyra couldn't read. Couldn't sleep either. Elyra set the sword down. Too much thinking. About tomorrow. About everything. About how I went from being discarded at a ball to standing in an armory the night before my wedding preparing for a coordinated assassination attempt. Sarastra's smile was grim. You've had an interesting few months. That's one word for it. Silence settled between them. Then the dowager spoke again, her voice quieter than usual. I lied to you. About what? When I said the hunger never goes away, that you just learn to use it as fuel. That's not entirely true. Then what is? Sometimes the hunger transforms into something else, something that looks like purpose or duty or love. And that transformation is more dangerous than the hunger ever was. Why? Because hunger can be controlled, managed, directed. But once it becomes something deeper, it starts making you reckless, starts making you care more about specific people than abstract principles. And in our world, that gets you killed. Elyra looked at the older woman. You're telling me not to care about Vaelor. I'm telling you that you already do. And tomorrow, that's going to make you vulnerable in ways hunger never could. What should I do about it? Survive anyway. Sarastra's eyes were fierce. Care about him. Let it make you strong instead of weak. And when the moment comes where you have to choose between your safety and his, make the choice that lets you both walk away. And if that choice doesn't exist, then make it exist. That's what empresses do. The dowager left her there with those words hanging in the air like a challenge. Elyra stood alone in the armory, surrounded by weapons and old violence, feeling the weight of tomorrow pressing down like a physical thing. In less than 12 hours, she'd walk down an aisle wearing black silk and silver threading. Assassins would be waiting. Morvain would make his move. The Ash Dominion would try to end them both and fracture the Empire into chaos. And she would either survive through a combination of planning and luck, or she would die proving that some women refuse to break even when the world tries to shatter them. Either way, tomorrow would rewrite everything. The only question was whether she'd live long enough to see what the new story looked like. Elyra picked up the sword one more time, felt its weight, its balance, its potential for violence. Then she carried it back to her quarters and set it beside her bed. Because if tomorrow was the day she died, she'd be damned if she went down unarmed. And if tomorrow was the day she survived, she'd make sure every person who'd tried to kill her regretted underestimating what a discarded woman could become when she decided she was done being anyone's victim. The moon rose over Vareth's capital. The palace settled into uneasy silence, and Elyra finally slept. Not peacefully, but with the kind of rest that comes from knowing you've done everything possible to prepare, and that whatever happens next is beyond control, beyond planning, beyond everything except the brutal reality of survival. Dawn broke over Vareth like a wound opening in the sky. Elyra woke to the sound of guards changing shifts outside her door. The palace was already moving with the organized chaos of a major event. Servants rushing to prepare the ceremonial hall. Nobles arriving from across the empire to witness what they believed would be a simple wedding. They had no idea they were walking into a battlefield. She dressed alone, refused the handmaidens who came to help. This was something she needed to do herself. Every clasp, every pin, every piece of armor disguised as wedding finery. The dress fit like it had been made for someone else, and she'd grown into it through sheer force of will. Black silk that caught light like oil on water. Silver threading that traced patterns resembling both crown and blade. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was unrecognizable from the one who'd stood in an eastern palace months ago waiting to be chosen. That woman had believed love was survival. This woman knew survival was its own form of love. A knock on the door. Sarastra entered without waiting for permission. She studied Elyra with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You look like you're preparing for war." "I am." The dowager crossed the room and placed something in Elyra's hand. A thin blade, barely longer than her palm, in a sheath that could be strapped to her thigh beneath the dress. "Just in case your other preparations fail." Elyra looked at the weapon, at this final acknowledgement that today might end in blood despite all their planning. "And you think I'll be able to use this if it comes to it? I think you've already proven you'll do what's necessary when survival demands it." Sarastra's voice was quiet. "The question isn't whether you can. It's whether you'll forgive yourself after. And will I? Eventually. If you live long enough." The brutal honesty was almost comforting. Elyra strapped the blade to her thigh and let the dress fall back over it. "How much time?" 1 hour. The guests are already gathering. Vaelor is with Arctis doing final security checks. Morvain is coordinating his fake defenses while thinking we don't know he's dismantling the real ones. And when he moves, we move faster. The dowager's smile was sharp as winter. You just focus on walking down that aisle without looking like you're expecting assassins at every turn. Performance until the end. Performance is survival until survival becomes victory. Sarastra left her alone with those words and the weight of what was coming. Elyra walked to the window and looked out over the capital one more time. Somewhere down there, Cassian Thornvale was probably waking up in his marriage bed next to the legitimacy he'd traded her for. Somewhere, the Ash Dominion was preparing to strike. Somewhere, the future was racing toward her like a blade in the dark, and she was done being afraid of it. Fear had kept her small for too long, had made her apologize with her posture and shrink herself to fit other people's expectations, had convinced her that survival meant making herself useful enough that powerful men wouldn't discard her. But here's what she'd learned in the months between being thrown away and standing here preparing to claim an empire. Survival wasn't about making yourself indispensable to someone else's power. It was about becoming your own foundation, about refusing to let anyone else define your worth, about walking into fire and coming out forged instead of burned. She touched the blade hidden beneath silk and made herself one final promise. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would not break, would not beg, would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her crumble. She would stand or she would fall, but either way she would do it on her own terms. The bells began ringing across the capital, calling witnesses to the ceremony. It was time. What? The ceremonial hall had been transformed into something out of legend. Black marble columns wrapped in silver cloth. torches burning in iron sconces along the walls. The ancient throne of Vareth positioned at the far end where Vaelor would wait, and between the entrance and that throne, an aisle that suddenly looked impossibly long. 400 nobles filled the seats on either side. Every major house, every political faction, everyone who mattered in the empire's complex web of power. And somewhere among them, assassins wearing friendly faces. Elyra stood at the entrance, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes turned toward her. She recognized faces from that night months ago when Cassian had discarded her, Duchess Corinna with her predatory smile, Lord Harrow looking uncomfortable beside his daughter Seraphine. Nobles who'd watched her walk out in humiliation now watching her walk in wearing power like a second skin. And there, 3 rows back, Cassian Thornvale himself. Their eyes met across the distance. His expression was complicated. Regret mixed with anger, mixed with something that might have been recognition of his own catastrophic mistake. Elyra let herself smile, not with triumph, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd stopped needing his validation the moment she'd realized she could survive without it. Then she looked away. Because he didn't matter anymore. Had maybe never mattered except as a lesson in what happened when you let someone else determine your value. At the far end of the aisle, Vaelor stood beside the throne. He wore black and silver to match her dress. No crown yet. That would come after, but authority radiated from him like heat from forge fire. When their eyes met, something passed between them that had nothing to do with politics or strategy. Recognition. 2 people who'd been sharpened by the same brutal world and somehow found each other in the wreckage. The music began. Elyra started walking. Every step was measured, deliberate. The blade hidden beneath her dress pressed against her thigh with each movement. Around her, she could feel Arctus's loyal guards positioned at strategic points, could sense Sarastra watching from the side corridor, could almost taste the tension of knowing Morvaine's conspiracy was in motion and they were all just waiting to see who would strike first. She was halfway down the aisle when it happened. A guard near the eastern entrance moved wrong, too fast, reaching for a weapon that shouldn't have been there. Arctus's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Now! Chaos erupted. Loyal guards flooded the entrances, blocking exits. The assassin near the eastern door went down in a spray of blood. Shouts echoed through the marble columns. Nobles screamed and scrambled for cover. And Elyra ran. Not away from the throne. Toward it. Because if Morvaine's plan was unfolding, Vaelor was the primary target, and she'd be damned if she let him face it alone. She reached him as 3 more attackers revealed themselves among the crowd. Vaelor had already drawn a sword from beneath his ceremonial robes. His expression was absolutely cold. "Get behind me!" She pulled the blade from her thigh instead. Not a chance. His eyes widened fractionally at the sight of her armed in a wedding dress. Then something that might have been pride flashed across his face. "Stay close, then." They moved together as the hall descended into violence. Arctus's guards were everywhere, engaging assassins with brutal efficiency. But there were more enemies than they'd anticipated. Morvaine had been planning this longer and deeper than anyone realized. Speaking of Morvaine, the Chancellor appeared from a side entrance, no longer wearing the mask of loyal advisor. His expression was pure hatred. "You should have died quietly, Vaelor. Should have let the old families take back what you stole. But you had to bring this girl into it, had to prove you could elevate a discarded noblewoman into an empress just to mock the rest of us. The old families lost their right to rule when they nearly destroyed Vareth with their greed." Vaelor's voice was steel. "I rebuilt this empire from ash, and you're not going to tear it down just because you're nostalgic for chaos." Morvaine drew a blade. "Then I'll settle for tearing you down and letting the chaos rebuild itself." He lunged. Vaelor met him with the kind of precision that came from 30 years of combat. Steel rang against steel. They fought like men who'd spent years pretending to be allies while hating each other underneath. Around them, the battle raged. Elyra found herself facing an assassin who'd been posing as a servant. He was faster than her, better trained, but she'd spent weeks learning to fight dirty. She didn't try to match his skill, just dodged until she saw an opening and drove her small blade up under his ribs. He went down gasping, and Elyra stood over him, dress soaked in blood that wasn't hers, feeling nothing like the woman who'd ordered her first execution in that dark prison. That woman had hated the necessity of violence. This woman understood it was just another language empires spoke. She turned to find Vaelor. He'd disarmed Morvain and had the former chancellor on his knees. Blood dripped from a cut across the traitor's face. "Any last words before I end your conspiracy?" Morvain spat blood. "You think this ends anything? The Ash Dominion is bigger than me, bigger than you. You can kill everyone in this room and it won't matter. The Empire is rotting from within. You're just too arrogant to see it." Vaelor's expression didn't change. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life cutting out the rot, one traitor at a time." He drove the blade through Morvain's heart. The Chancellor collapsed, and suddenly the hall went quiet. Assassins dead or captured, loyal guards securing the space, nobles pressed against walls looking terrified and shocked in equal measure. In the center of it all, Vaelor and Elyra stood together, both armed, both covered in evidence of violence, both still breathing. Arctis approached, breathing hard from his own fighting. "The immediate threat is contained. We have 12 prisoners for interrogation. The rest are dead. Casualties on our side. 3 guards, 7 wounded. Could have been much worse." Vaelor nodded slowly, then turned to face the assembled nobles who were starting to emerge from their hiding places. His voice filled the hall with terrible authority. "You just witnessed what happens when people try to destroy this empire from within. Chancellor Morvain was a traitor working with the Ash Dominion to assassinate me and fracture Vareth into chaos. He failed. His conspiracy failed, and every remaining cell will be hunted down and eliminated." Silence. Then he did something that made Elyra's breath catch. He turned to her and extended his hand, not as king to subject, as equal to equal. She took it, let him pull her forward to stand beside him facing the crowd. This woman was discarded by a fool who couldn't recognize her worth. She survived assassination attempts, mastered impossible politics, and today fought beside me to save this empire. If anyone here questions whether she's worthy of the crown, speak now. Nobody spoke, because the evidence was written in blood across the marble floor. Vaelor's grip on her hand tightened. "Then let's finish what we started." He gestured to the officiant who'd been cowering behind a pillar. The man stumbled forward, robes askew, and somehow managed to remember the words. The ceremony was brief, brutal in its efficiency. No flowery language about love or devotion, just the binding legal phrases that made 2 people into one political unit. When it was done, Vaelor kissed her. Not gently, not for show, like a man claiming something he'd fought for and barely managed to keep. When he pulled back, his eyes held hers. "We survived." She smiled. "We did more than survive. We won." Around them, the hall slowly transformed from battlefield back to ceremony. Guards cleared bodies. Servants appeared to clean blood from marble. Nobles cautiously returned to their seats, looking shaken, but understanding they'd just witnessed history. And in the middle of it all, 2 people who'd been forged by fire stood together wearing crowns that cost more than anyone watching could ever understand. Instead, later, after the wounded had been treated and prisoners secured and nobles sent away with stories to spread across the empire, Elyra found herself alone with Vaelor in the private chambers that were now theirs. She was still wearing the blood-stained dress, too exhausted to change, too wired from adrenaline to sit still. He poured 2 glasses of something dark and strong and handed her one. "To surviving our wedding day." She laughed. It came out harsher than intended. Most couples worry about vows and flowers. We worried about coordinated assassination attempts. Most couples aren't trying to hold together an empire that half the known world wants to tear apart. They drank in silence for a moment. Then Vaelor spoke again, his voice quieter. "You fought today, with a blade hidden under your wedding dress. You killed a man without hesitation. I killed someone trying to kill us. There's a difference." "Is there?" He studied her. "Or are you just becoming the kind of person who can rationalize violence when it serves your goals?" The question hit harder than expected. Elyra set down her glass and met his eyes. "I don't know anymore. I used to think I knew exactly where the line was between necessary and unnecessary violence. But that line's gotten blurrier every day. And maybe that's what ruling does. Makes you compromise until you can't remember what you were trying to protect in the first place. And if you wake up one day and realize you've become a monster, then I hope I'm the kind of monster who still serves the empire better than the alternative." Her voice was steady. I'm not going to pretend I'm still the woman Cassian discarded. That woman is dead. I killed her myself through every hard choice I made. But what replaced her is stronger, more dangerous, more capable of doing what this position requires. She moved closer to him. The question isn't whether I've changed, it's whether you can live with what I've become. Vaelor's expression was unreadable. I've spent 20 years becoming a king everyone fears and no one loves. I've made choices that haunt me, sacrificed people who trusted me because the empire required it, turned myself into something barely recognizable as human. He reached out and touched her face with careful precision. And then you appeared. Someone who understood the cost without flinching, who could walk through the same darkness and come out still capable of caring. Who made me remember that ruling doesn't have to mean dying inside piece by piece. So yes, I can live with what you've become, because what you've become is the only person in this empire I actually trust. The rawness of it was almost unbearable. Elyra felt something crack open in her chest. All the walls she'd built, all the armor she'd worn, all the careful distance she'd maintained. What are we actually doing here, Vaelor? Building something that might last? Or destroying each other trying? I honestly don't know which yet. That's a terrible foundation for a marriage. His smile was sharp and genuine. Good thing this was never supposed to be a marriage. Just a political arrangement between two people too damaged to know better. And now it's something I don't have words for. Something that looks like partnership and feels like necessity and might actually be what other people call love if we'd ever learned how to recognize it. She kissed him then. Not from strategy or performance, but from the simple need to be close to someone who understood exactly what survival cost. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. I'm terrified of this. Of caring about you. Of giving you power to hurt me worse than anyone else ever could. Good. That means it's real. And real is the only thing worth having when everything else is performance. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd been sharpened by the same brutal world finding unexpected comfort in shared damage. Eventually, Elyra pulled back. What happens tomorrow? After the immediate crisis is over and we have to actually govern together. Tomorrow we start rooting out every remaining Ash Dominion cell. We rebuild the intelligence networks Morvain compromised. We deal with the noble houses who were wavering about supporting the crown. And we prove that this empire is stronger with both of us holding it together than it ever was with just one. And us. We figure that out as we go. His voice was rough. No promises except honesty. No illusions except the ones we choose together. Just two people who refuse to let the world break them. She could live with that. Had to live with that. Because the alternative was going back to being the kind of person who needed someone else's validation to feel whole. And she'd burned that version of herself to ash. 6 months later. Elyra stood on the western terrace of Nightspire, watching the sun set over the capital. The empire had stabilized. The Ash Dominion cells had been systematically dismantled. Trade routes flourished. Border disputes quieted under diplomatic pressure instead of escalating into war. Vareth was thriving, and she'd helped make it happen. Not through manipulation or behind-the-scenes influence while some man took credit, but through actual governance, policy decisions that carried her name, trade agreements negotiated with her authority, military strategies implemented with her approval. She'd become exactly what Vaelor had promised, an empress in function, not just title. And it had cost her everything soft she'd once believed made her human. She heard footsteps behind her, recognized them without turning. Vaelor joined her at the railing, silent for a moment. Then he spoke. Cassian Thornvale sent a letter requesting audience. Says he wants to discuss territorial disputes in the eastern provinces. Do the territorial disputes actually require discussion? No. Arctis says they're minor issues the local governors can handle. Cassian just wants FaceTime with the crown to rebuild his credibility. Then tell him no. Let him learn what it feels like to be dismissed by people with better options. Vaelor's smile was sharp. Already done. I just thought you'd want to know he's still trying to climb back into relevance. And failing. Spectacularly. They stood in comfortable silence watching the capital below. The 1,000 lights burning against darkness. The evidence of human life continuing despite the violence and politics happening in palace halls. Vaelor finally broke the quiet. Do you ever regret it? saying yes that night in the carriage, trading one uncertain future for another. Elyra considered the question honestly. 6 months ago, she might have said no immediately, defended her choice with fierce certainty, but she'd learned that truth was more complicated than convenient answers, sometimes. When I see what it's cost, what I've had to become, the pieces of myself I had to kill to survive this. She paused, but then I remember who I was before. Someone whose entire worth was tied to being useful to a man who saw me as disposable. And I realized that woman was dying slowly anyway. At least this way I chose the transformation. And now I'm someone who shapes empires instead of just surviving in them. Someone who makes decisions that affect thousands of lives. Someone who can look in the mirror and recognize strength instead of just seeing what men have decided I'm worth. She turned to face him fully. So no, I don't regret it. But I mourn what I had to sacrifice to get here. And I'll carry that mourning for the rest of my life. That's the real price of power. His voice was quiet. Not what you gain, what you have to bury to make room for it. Is it worth it? Ask me in 20 years when we've either built something that lasts or destroyed each other trying. Fair enough. They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. And Elyra felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace or might have been just exhaustion disguised as acceptance. Either way, she'd survived, had taken the worst the world could throw at her and turned it into armor, had walked into fire and come out forged instead of burned, had proven that being discarded wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a better one where she didn't need anyone's permission to matter, didn't need anyone's validation to be powerful. Didn't need anything except her own refusal to let the world define her worth. Vaelor's hand found hers in the gathering darkness. No words, just connection. Two people who'd been broken by the same brutal reality and somehow found unexpected strength in shared survival. It wasn't the fairy tale ending other people dreamed about, but it was real and honest and theirs. And that was enough. Years later, when historians wrote about the reign of King Vaelor and Empress Elyra, they'd focus on the policies and wars and diplomatic achievements. They'd catalog the reforms that strengthened Vareth, the enemies defeated, the prosperity restored, but they'd miss the real story underneath. The story of a woman who learned that survival wasn't about making yourself indispensable to someone else's power. It was about becoming your own foundation. The story of two people too damaged to love easily, but too stubborn to give up on each other. The story of an empire held together not by fear or tradition, but by the brutal partnership of two survivors who refused to break. That story wouldn't fit in history books. It lived in the quiet moments between crisis and governance. In the way Elyra walked into council meetings and commanded respect without asking for it. In the way Vaelor learned to share power instead of hoarding it. In the way they stood together on terraces watching sunsets and not needing to fill the silence with promises they might not keep. Because the only promise that mattered was already written in blood and steel and the stubborn refusal to let anyone else determine their fate. They would survive, together or separately, but always on their own terms. And the empire they built would reflect that truth, hard, uncompromising, honest about the cost of power, but stronger for acknowledging what it took to hold everything together. Elyra never forgot the night Cassian discarded her in front of 400 nobles. Never forgot the humiliation or the pain or the moment she realized her worth had never been tied to his choice. But she stopped letting it define her, stopped using it as fuel for revenge. Let it become just another scar in a collection of wounds that proved she'd survived things that should have destroyed her. And when she looked in the mirror decades later, silver threading through her hair, an experience written in the lines of her face, she saw exactly what she'd fought to become. Not someone's discarded mistake, not a cautionary tale about women who reached too high, but an empress who'd earned her crown through fire and blood and the absolute refusal to let the world tell her she wasn't strong enough. That was the victory. Not revenge, not triumph over enemies, but the quiet certainty of a life earned instead of given. A life she'd built with her own hands from the wreckage of everything that tried to break her. And that was worth more than any crown, more than any empire, more than any fairy tale ending could ever be. Because it was real, and it was hers. and no one could ever take it away.